RC, thank you so much for joining us, and Daniel, Simon, both from World Literature Today. I mean, thank you so much for partnering with us this year on the annual Yedida Kaufman Stillman Memorial Lecture. We've turned it from a one-time, one talk to a kind of a double-day event. And I'm so glad that you guys are able to bring an entirely new dimension to this, because I don't think our faculty has the expertise to talk intelligently with Ilan about today's subject. So I'm really appreciative, and I'm really appreciative of Ilan for joining us from Amherst. We wanted to have him out here in person. I've admired his works for an awfully long time, but given the fact that we're in the middle of or at the tail end of an ice storm, it turns out that was a good decision anyway, even though we made it because of coronavirus concerns. But it's still great to see you. We're looking forward to spending the day with you. And see, that's my little slow rolling invitation. That gives people 2 or 3 more minutes to join the, and this isn't a webinar, it's a Zoom, so everyone can ask questions at the end. And RC, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. I am RC Davis-Undiano, Executive Director and Neustadt Professor at the World Literature Today organization at OU. I'm so pleased to welcome all of you to this conversation today with our very special guest, Professor Ilan Stavans. And I, too, am so pleased the World Literature Today and the Schusterman Center for Judaic and Israel Studies have been able to collaborate on Professor Stavans' virtual visit to the University of Oklahoma. Thank you, Dr. Alan Levinson. We love partnering with you. We've done it before, and you all are a dream unit to partner with. So we look forward to many more such occasions in the future. I will say a few words by way of introduction, and then we'll jump into a conversation with our special guest. Born in Mexico, Professor Stavans teaches at Amherst College, where he is the Lewis-Sebring Professor in Latin American and Latino culture. His career extends in many directions, both as scholar and public intellectual. His work includes scholarly monographs such as The Hispanic Condition and comic strips, as in his graphic book, Latino USA, A Cartoon History. He was also the host of a syndicated PBS show, Conversations with Ilan Stavans, which ran from 2001 to 2006. He has written influential essays on the Mexican comedian Cantinflas, and Day of the Dead artist Jose Guadalupe Posada, the Chicano union leader Cesar Chavez, and the Tejana singer Selena. I'm just giving you some highlights, obviously. He wrote a book about the board game Loteria, which includes his own poems. Featured in one of the Smithsonian Q&A book programs, he has received numerous international prizes, including the Latino Literature Prize, Chile's Presidential Medal, and the Rubén Darío Distinction. His most recent book is entitled, What is American Literature? And I'm going to hold up my copy here just to make it convincing, which when I say that I got it a few days ago, have already read it, and it was a great read. You need to get a copy for sure. In our conversation today, we're going to discuss the status of American literature, if it is healthy or in trouble, with a segue to the rise of Mexican-American literature and the great predicament of humanists in a polarized, combative age. We'll also have some time at the end for questions. I'll keep an eye on the clock, and when we have about 15 minutes left, I will switch over. And as you know, it's a regular Zoom call, so you all will be able to jump in and just ask questions of Dr. Stavans. I think that few people I know are better equipped to cover this territory than Ilan Stavans, who brings a variety of Jewish, Mexican, and other informed perspectives to his work. To give us an initial point of reference, I'm going to ask him to describe the typical American literature survey course he took as an undergraduate. Ilan, what were you reading, and how was the professor approaching the material?
Well, first, RC, it's a pleasure to be here with you, even if the here is not always clear. I wish I was on the their side, but we make do with what we can. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you very much, Alan, Trice, and everybody at the University of Oklahoma. I look forward to meeting you in person. I'm honored by the invitation, humbled, and look forward to a conversation with you. RC, I was born, raised, and spent, now it's less than half of my life, but a generous, probably the most formative period of my life in Mexico City, the child of children that were themselves children of either Holocaust survivors or immigrants that had come from the Pale of Settlement in Eastern Europe. Yiddish was the dominant language at home. It was my first language, and Spanish was the language of the street. I have the way Richard Rodriguez talks about it in Hunger of Memory, a separation between the private language and the public language, in that engages with a private identity, and that is a minority defined identity, and a public identity that is national and more collective, and so on. I had no readings connected with American literature. If we talk about American literature as US literature, when I was growing up or in my undergraduate years, I don't remember reading Huckleberry Finn. I don't remember reading Walt Whitman. I don't remember ever knowing anything about Emily Dickinson, which has become a crucial figure in my life, in part because her house is about a block and a half away from mine. And I always pass by and say hello, and she throws a candy and a smile from that second floor. In other words, America was Star Trek, in Star Wars, in Disney, in whatever came through popular culture. It was, and even in Star Trek and in Star Wars, in Star Trek, it was always dubbed into Spanish. My father, who died a couple of years ago, was a prominent telenovela, soap opera actor in Mexico, who during my childhood made his living dubbing American television shows into Spanish. And so I could hear my father's language in Yiddish at home, and then in Spanish in the Flintstones, which was always a kind of fascinating duality. On the other hand, RC, I became a reader of Borges rather early on, discovering him on my own. And Borges was my Virgil in introducing me to American writers. It was thanks to him that I read Hawthorne, The Scarlet Letter, the journals, Thoreau, Edgar Allan Poe, Whitman, Twain. And so I can tell you that what I have a very haphazard, self-taught, maybe jazzy approach to American literature. I know when I tell my students, you have to read this chapter of 100 Years of Solitude for tomorrow, that there is something painful about a teacher telling a student what to read. What I loved about my adolescent experience, especially with American literature, was that nobody told me what to read, and so I found it on my own. And if I didn't like it, I wouldn't blame anybody. It was my own fault or Borges' fault, and he wasn't there to respond. Most of the readings at the beginning were in Spanish, in so-so translations. Even the translations that Borges himself had done of Leaves of Grass were very Borgesian and not so much Whitmanian. And it was only RC when I came to the United States as an immigrant at the age of 25, hoping not to become a pariah here, that I pushed myself to learn the language more fully and to start reading American literature. And my first experience as an immigrant is with a copy of Moby Dick in English. I had read the book in Spanish, and with a Spanish-English dictionary next to me. And from Call Me Ishmael to those entire first 2-3 pages, trying to figure out what Melville was saying, and then closing my eyes, trying to remember the difficult words, making a list of the difficult words, going back to the page and seeing if I now understood more. I don't know why I started with that big white whale of a book. Maybe because it's a very Latin American book. I find Moby Dick to be one of the great Latin American novels. But it was my introduction to this country, to this language, and to this literature.
Ilan, let me jump in. So I think you had a very expansive, good approach to American literature. You approached it through the literature of the hemisphere, mainly from what you knew from Latin America. Take my education, for example. I went to graduate school at UC Davis, and looking back, and this honestly astounds me as I think about it now, none of us questioned the fact that American literature was being defined, if you look at it on a map, as this tiny little region, largely homogenous in New England, was taken as the whole of American literature, defining the themes, defining the genres, etc. And then there were the little supplemental add-ons that ripple across the rest of the map. And we put up with that for so long, defining the entire of the national literature in terms of this one little spot of regional literature on the Eastern Seaboard. I wonder why US put up with that for so long when it made so little sense. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I don't know if I have a full-fledged explanation. I do have a complete feeling of empathy toward what you are describing. Even when reading Borges was infatuated with the transcendentalist Emerson, Thoreau, Whitman. He doesn't talk much about the American Civil War, but what that moment of transformation made in America, that is what was being filtered to Argentina. And that was in turn being filtered to me through Argentina to understand what American literature was. And by the way, years later, I found myself sitting next to John Updike at an event, and he told me that he, a product of New England, had discovered Hawthorne because he had read an essay by Borges that had inspired him to read an ancestor of his directly from the region. It's the inception and the conception of America that starts in Cape Cod, and the Plymouth plantation, and that control of the Northeast that will take time to spread its echoes, its concentric circles. It remains today the center of the publishing industry, New York City, the center of where the money goes or comes from when it is fostering what America is all about. But it could also be the most parochial and limited. In American literature, we know extraordinarily well, is far beyond and much more complex than anything like that. The big tensions of the canons and who is in and who is out were defined by the vision that they were New England, meaning that they were replicating a kind of zealous religious Canaanite view of the world of this side of the Atlantic, and that they held into that knowledge. But on the other hand, and I know we're going to talk, and I'm eager and I'm ready, RC, on the other hand, there was a sense of connection with the land that population had. When Emerson and Thoreau look at nature, they see the nature of the environment. They don't see beyond the Mississippi. They don't see Florida. They don't see the missionaries and the explorers. They see that context, and they feel an exaltation, a sense of religious continuation that that speaks still to us in a very powerful way, a parochial way, a limited way, a gender-defined way, but not without its merits and its power.
I was just thinking, when I was aware that the canon started changing, I guess as more diverse students came into the classroom, universities responded. I'm guessing, I'm thinking back to the Heath Anthology of American Literature. It seemed to me the one that actually broke the barrier a little bit and didn't just talk about diversity, but actually had a number of more diverse texts. And the general line since then is that American literature has made itself more complex, more of a comprehensive view by bringing more diverse texts in from across the country, from different communities. What's your sense of what's happened? Is it your sense that there's been a kind of cosmetic tweaking, or it's been more a remaking of American literature, or something in between? What's your judgment on what's happened in this recanonization?
I can't thank you enough, RC, for that question. It's a question at the heart of what I think is my relationship to what I read, and my relationship through what I write and through what I teach to my environment. As an immigrant, I felt at the beginning that I was an absolute outsider. Maybe my Jewish condition also added to this, the idea that you are coming from the margins, that you're a minority, that you watch, you witness, you chronicle, but you're not necessarily at the center of power, so to speak. And it took me some time to realize that there was an openness to outsiders, to comment, to reflect, to expand. And I wanted to participate in that larger discussion. I wanted to feel that the canon was not closed, that the canon is a work in progress, that nobody really knows what it is, and that is what makes it so attractive. The constant tension between the imaginary list that it includes and the proposed changes that it should have. Because of my formation, which is, as I mentioned, intellectual formation, which, as I mentioned, is very improvisational and haphazard and accidental, I really think of myself as an accidental reader. And I love to retain, as much as I can, that capacity to stumble on a book, to feel that something, I didn't know about this, and I need to learn more right now. And it's as if nothing else matters but reading about that new author that is in front of me. That I also realized that from a very early stage, the role of anthologies had played an important part in my education. The Bible as an anthology, the role of the Talmud. And in schools, even in Mexico, the different types of omnibuses and anthologies that the teachers would bring into class. It's simply a textbook is an anthology of topics that come from different parts, little segments that are privileged vis-a-vis others. And I love the concept of an anthology. I think the anthology is a portable library, a library of windows that throw us into new universes. We're just getting one poem by this author and one short story by this other one, but it's not because we only want readers to read that poem or that story, but because that's the entrance to the poetry of such an author or the short story of the other author. And I also think that an anthology is always two anthologies. It's the anthology with everything that was included, that is in, and the anthology has its own double with everything that was left out. When you open an anthology, you're always thinking, what did the editor not include? What is it? What is outside this book? And I, the hope is always that in the anthology, what is in is better than what is out. And that there is a silent presence by the editor who's, by curating what it is proposing to you to read the world this particular way. Is not telling you this is the only world that exists. This is my world, the way I would give you a poem or a short story. So I have myself engaged with the process of making anthologies, of critiquing anthologies, of being criticized as the editor of anthologies, all part of the same negotiation, because I think that the opening of the American canon is the proposal that we all make as readers of different ways of reading. Sometimes the same entry from a different perspective, sometimes, more often, different entries from a variety of different perspectives. There is no, just as you can't swim in the same river twice, you can't read the same book twice. You have changed, the book has changed. And so the canon is the way the new generation will reappropriate the material that comes from the past, discarding some and celebrating others, and bring in a whole array of new material, new classics that will now make it to that new shelf.
Ilan, let me kind of reframe this topic, maybe from just in a little different way. So somebody listening to this conversation so far might say, oh yeah, academic types quibbling over what goes in anthologies, what goes in, what goes out. Yeah, they're the only ones that are going to notice this. But let me bring it down to something a lot more fundamental. And this takes us into the pages of your What is American Literature, which is, I think, the question here. We're in a situation now where certain books, what you call tested texts, tested books, what we generally call the classics, are in some way unreadable in the classroom. Huckleberry Finn would be an example. People don't want to encounter the N-word, and so the book is unreadable. And for various reasons, maybe people are going to want to cancel Moby Dick, or so many other works that Uncle Tom's Cabin would be a prime example. Maybe they wouldn't even want The Awakening or The Age of Innocence because they're part of the canon. We're in an impossible situation where the books that we've used to define who we are for so long are now getting canceled, getting problematic in some way. And let me just express one worry on this, and I'll throw it to you. If we cleanse our past so completely and comb through the canon so that all that's left are discourses and texts that we're comfortable with where we are right now, it has a kind of Soviet feel that we're washing the past and we're going to clean it up and only go with what somehow passes a test right now. It seems like we put ourselves in a very, very difficult situation. So my question is, is it possible that those tested books still need to have a place, or are we going to be comfortable just canceling them out of the syllabus?
Cancel culture is about bonfires. It's about destruction. It's about blindness. It's about idiocy. It develops in me a kind of allergy that looks back at the history of my own people, the Jewish people, in different moments where Kristallnacht, the Inquisition, books needed to be burnt or forbidden because they were too dangerous for the environment. I'm very attracted, RC, to, and have written on a number of occasions on censorship, the allure of censorship, the moment of censorship, that we are experiencing right now. One of my books about 4 months ago, a book that I, don't think highly of, was put in a list by a Texan, a Republican politician, of the books that should be taken out of libraries and of high schools because it is dangerous. And any public library or any high school that receives, and of course, because they are public, they do, funds, the funds will be taken away if those books, mine and 800 others, remain on those bookshelves. The idea here is that a book will make people uncomfortable. Thus, it has to be taken out. But that is exactly what we want the classroom to be. Yeah. Not an unsafe place, but an uncomfortable place. A place where people can think thoughts that they didn't think before. And how are they going to do it? By being exposed to all sorts of ideas that are surprising to them, that might make them feel unlike themselves, to get them out of the comfort zone. Just as censor culture makes my hair go up, this idea of comfort zone gets my hair go up. If I get out of my comfort zone, who am I? Well, you have become a tourist, you have become a traveler, you have become a voyager. You are now in a process of understanding what home is. Ithaca is only Ithaca because of the departure from Ithaca and the return to Ithaca. If Ulysses Odysseus stays in Ithaca, he would never know exactly what it was. You have to leave home. At the same time, we have to recognize that censorship is as old as humankind, and there is always the power struggle of not wanting others to read what we don't want them to read, or having them only read what we want. And being a publisher myself, I know that it's good to have a book censored. And I'm not advising it, but the books that have been censored end up being the books that are read the most. And the truth is that having a book censored, the worst crime is not to read a bad book, but not to read. And I have the impression, frankly, that the Republican politician who put my book in that list did not read it. Because had he read it, he would have realized that that book has nothing to do with the topics that he was putting out. Unfortunately, he didn't even open it, which is, the book has received a little more attention as a result, but we're never going to bring down censorship altogether. We have to fight it. But the biggest responsibility is at a time when books matter less, when the act and art of reading are being reduced with storytelling in all sorts of different forms, and when the younger generation is very distracted with countless stimuli that keep their attention in a state of constant frenetic, craziness. It's very important to invite people back to the relaxation, to the intimacy of reading, and to the surprise of reading. If you don't like an author, that author is for you. That's good. You don't have to like everything you read. The whole point is to discover things that you don't read. And very quickly, RC, to the topic of the classics that are not read anymore. I recently, about 2 years ago, I tried to reread Uncle Tom's Cabin with about 80 high schoolers. It was very difficult. Yeah. It's not written very well. No. I did the same thing with Huckleberry Finn. We had a blast. It was amazing. So not all classics are created equal.
Just quick 2 references, and I think you'll see why I'm bringing this up. I remember the federal judge in the United States that had to deal with the case of Ulysses, James Joyce's Ulysses, being brought into the United States, and had to decide if it was obscene or not, and decided that as a work of art, he wasn't going to rule on the obscenity, and that he protected it and brought it in. And second reference, is apparently the Attorney General of the state of Oklahoma right now is looking at a list of 54 books, which include Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, Rodolfo Anaya's Bless Me Ultima, 54 books that are being considered for censorship to be taken out of school libraries and school classrooms in the state. And it hasn't happened yet, but it's something that's in process right now. It seems that there was a respect for the approach you're talking about in the past, a kind of democracy of reading that we seem to have lost a little bit. There's something bad afoot, that we're a little too eager, too willing to stop that open conversation that you're talking about.
I know, because you and I corresponded before this conversation, that this is going to be a topic on which you will want to expand. But let me begin here. I think we are at a perilous moment in American democracy. We no longer have one country. We have at least two countries, if not many more countries, and countries that have probably the biggest challenge, have no center and no heart, pulling in different directions, often not even wanting to sit on the same dinner table to communicate family members. And frankly, this is a recipe for collapse. It's not, there are all sorts of strategies that we can do. And of course, as educators, we will try to come up with. But if the United States was at an inflection point during the American Civil War, I don't feel that we are that far from that moment in which Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, and according to Lincoln, was the book by this little lady that ignited the entire Civil War. I don't think that a book would ignite the Second American Civil War, but it's probably in books that we will see where we are right now. I think that the classics are the memory of a nation, and that memory keeps on changing, it's shifting all the time. It's obviously, they are books, and as books, they don't say anything until somebody opens them. And so the memory of the nation is the memory of people that relate to those books all the time, and that interpret them. I see the journey down the Mississippi by Hogg and Jim as a journey that we all make. We are all on that raft together. And we can say that Twain appropriated the language of runaway slaves, that he was white and he invented it. Yeah, but so did Shakespeare with Shylock and with Othello. There is no artistic act that is not in some way an appropriation. And there is no act that also does not entail some form of barbaric approach to our environment, theft, reconstruction. That is what art is. That it's not about painting a beautiful picture. It's by painting a complex picture. And last, RC, Mark Twain once said that a classic is a book that everybody knows, but nobody reads. It wasn't that he was advocating for censorship. He was advocating for reading them. But the classics also have a way to reach us by osmosis, and eventually some of us make our way to the actual book to recognize. They are very patient books, the classics. They wait for us. Contemporary books are less patient. They will not last long.
I want to switch you to something else. I'm kind of watching the time, and I want to make sure that we get to this. And it's kind of a relief to bring this topic up. The rise of Mexican-American, Chicano literature, and addresses a lot of the issues that we're talking about. And it was, if I can say this, a healthier time where Chicano literature was a possibility in the world. I'm not sure that it would be right now. Would you talk a little bit about the Chicano movement in the 60s and the rise of Mexican-American Chicano literature in the 70s, and sense of what it was accomplishing?
Absolutely. I have been very interested in that tradition, RC, because I feel myself close to it, though I'm not a Chicano. I'm a Mexican who immigrated to the United States. And I have come to that literature in many ways as I have come to the literature of New England as an outsider, reading it and trying to understand it in the place it has in connection with locality, in connection with gender, in connection with the issues that have to do with voice and representation. The 60s were very similar to the 2020s in the summer, a moment of intense upheaval, of coalescing forces that were coming from different sides that were pushing to be seen more clearly and openly. It felt as if a real revolution was taking place, but not a Bolshevik revolution, but a revolution that had to do with changing the status quo from all sorts of perspectives and all sorts of locations. There had been a Mexican-American literature before, dating back to the 19th century, to the colonial period, depending on how far we want to go. But the Chicano literature that comes across in the late 50s, in the 60s, and in the 70s is a literature of urgency. It's a literature that connects with social justice, that connects with the issue that we want to be part of this larger experiment, even though we have been occupied, we have been marginalized, we have a stake here as well. And there are a number of voices that are crucial that come across, all of them in that period, a few of them later on. Rudy Anaya, whom you've done a lot of wonderful work and whom you were close to. I had the fortune of being with Rudy 3 or 4 times and spending marvelous hours of conversation. And Rudy presented an aspect of Chicano literature that is connected with mysticism, with magic, with the supernatural, in a way that is authentic, that relates to indigenous voices in this country, and not to the magic realism of Garcia Marquez or Julio Cortázar or other writers from Latin America. At the same time, you have figures like many of the poets, Abelardo Delgado, Rolando Hinojosa, who is more of an establishment figure. And right. Again, a figure I've been close to. One of the figures that I'm very attracted to in that period, because of how radical he is Oscar Zeta Acosta, this man who wrote the autobiography of a brown buffalo and the revolt of the cockroach people, which I think are extraordinary books. As in the case of Sor Juana and Frida Kahlo, they come with a myth of who Oscar Zeta Acosta was, that he disappeared, that he might have died of an overdose in Mazatlan, all those terrific aspects. He still is a marginal figure. Why is Mexican figure not more at the center of American literature right now? That's a complex and fascinating question. I think that the resentment against that literature prevails in the hallways of power in New York City. The fact that they believe that it doesn't sell, that it's a kitchen literature, that it's a literature that doesn't come with a highbrow tradition. They are all misconceptions, but those misconceptions are always at the heart of many traditions, and it takes one pivotal figure often to change that, as was the case, for instance, of Junot Diaz in the Dominican American tradition or the Caribbean tradition. So it's an interesting case. It's the story of Sandra Cisneros, how far she went, but also how limited she went in certain aspects. And I have been vocal about that.
Disappointing she was in some ways later.
In some ways, absolutely. So, but I think that it's a tradition that is very much alive, is incredibly rich, and it's waiting for a crucial moment to make its case through one or a group of individuals.
You probably know this, but it's fun for me to talk about. I'll say it real briefly. So, the two gifted writers that really kind of pushed Chicano literature out front very quickly were Rudolfo Anaya Anaya, but also Tomas Rivera,
Yeah.
who was a graduate of the University of Oklahoma. I don't know if you know that. So I think
know.
OU and Norman plays a huge part in what he achieved. And we don't.
I think Tomas Rivera is a fascinating figure, not only for what he produced in the voices that he created in Y no se lo tragó la tierra and the editor not part, but because he has become a classic by the sheer. A classic is also a book that survives translation. And I love the approaches that have been taken to Y no se lo tragó la tierra by different translators, how each of them takes a different approach to it, and how the book does or doesn't come through it. But the fact that we keep on reading it is an example of what a classic can do.
I've written a play about him. I'll share it with you sometime because I'm really trying to get people to refocus on him again. Listen, Ilan, I'm really watching the time, and I want to make sure we have time for questions from people that are with us. I want to go back to some of the implications of our conversation earlier. In this era of political polarization and cultural divisiveness, is the American idea of a multicultural democracy, in your opinion, seriously in jeopardy? To what degree are you still hopeful on behalf of the American idea?
It's an incredible jeopardy. I don't know, frankly, RC, if our democracy is going to survive. The very last chapter of What is American Literature is a letter to an editor of a small local newspaper about how the Second American Civil War devastated the country. And it came around 2024, and the effects that it had on the population. It's science fiction. When I write it, I hope it will remain science fiction and it will not become a reality. What is at stake now? At stake is the very belief that we can be out of many one, a pluribus unum. I don't know if we can remain one. I would like to think that we can remain one. I came to this country honestly because this country offered that idea that I could become one among the many too. But the fact that the disinformation that goes on both ends, the dogmatism, you were talking about Soviet approaches, both on the left and on the right, the sense that we in academia have created this echo chamber that makes us feel good, but is absolutely disconnected with what is happening outside in the real world, only exacerbates the situation. I don't know if any op-ed piece or any documentary that is done can really bring us back together. Maybe a big shakeup. After all, we're a very young nation, and European nations had to go through misery in order to come back to clarity and enlightenment. It is not the recipe, it's not the path that I would like to take. But I have to confess, RC, of frequently feeling disheartened. I love the new generation of students that I have. It's bright, savvy, informed, creative, audacious. It also feels distracted and disengaged, interested in certain aspects that are not connected with the past. I don't know if the oldest democracy will become the lasting democracy. I'm hoping that it will. I also believe that the age of strong men is upon us here and in other places. We saw it last night. We saw it right now in the Ukraine. And I don't think that Trump is an exception in the chronology of American presidents. I remember asking a columnist of the New York Times a couple of years ago if when we had W. Bush, we used to say, oh, nothing worse is going to come. If it's possible to imagine that after Donald Trump, nothing worse is going to come. And he said, no, nothing worse is going to come. But that is a mistaken view of history, as if the present is always the end of time. The fact is Trump inaugurated, unleashed a series of forces that are very dangerous and make us less exceptional, unique than we want to think.
Let me ask you a follow-up question to what you just said, and this will be my last question, and then we can go to questions from our guests. So what advice do you give to young humanists who want to do some good in the world, but on occasion get intimidated by the difficulty of breaking through the skepticism and the negativity of much contemporary public discourse?
My first answer to that, RC, is to tell them nothing that I tell you should be taken at face value. Question anything that comes from me and anything that comes from anybody else. No information should be seen as dogma, and it is important for you to broaden your mind. The classroom where we are is a place to experiment, but if your experiment ends in the classroom, I will have failed and so will you. You have to go out of this classroom and do something with that knowledge. And be testy, be innovative, be improvisational, surprise even your old teachers who think that you have a lot of talent and somewhere to go. And more than anything, bring us hope, because we, the previous generation, likely have failed in keeping the glue together. And it will be up to you to figure out if that glue is still somewhere to be found and for some continuity to take place.
Great answer. Okay, folks, we promised time for questions at the end. If you want to just activate your microphone and jump in with questions for Dr. Stavans. Anybody?
Well, while people are gathering their questions, I'll start on a lighthearted one. So, Dr. Stavans, are you telling us that a generation of Mexico City dwellers grew up listening to the Flintstones spoken with a Yiddish accent?
Yes, I'm telling you that the Flintstones are our ancestors. They are as Mexican as they can be, because I heard it. They had my father's voice, and that was Mexican. And that I'm also saying, Alan, that there's a lot that comes from popular culture that defines who we are, and that maybe in this generation, that is the lucky, that is the root. One of the things that I admire enormously about American culture, Alan, is that it erases the line between highbrow and pop, that in other cultures is more emphatic and accentuated. So that you can have somebody like Quentin Tarantino doing wonderful B movies. This is just the concept itself is very attractive. And I think that there's a lot to be explored through popular culture, sometimes directly and sometimes not, in that popular culture is not as monolithic as we think. A Yiddish-speaking child of immigrants ended up doing a voice for the Flintstones.
Somebody else?
I raised my hand. Am I first in the queue?
You are.
Hi, I'm Jim. I've really enjoyed this, so thanks very much. I'm teaching an American Lit Survey class this semester, and we began the semester with some Whitman. And it was interesting to me that as we talked about what I call the poetics of the penny, and you alluded to with E Pluribus Unum, as we reading bits of Song of Myself and specifically the poem The Sleepers, my students, like very astutely, but in ways that threw me off balance, wondered if the stuff was parody, because they found the romantic message of potential harmony like so askew to the facts then and now. So like one, I just wanted to share that to see how you find that interesting. And then two, a more specific question is, I'm interested in the way you formulate classics as tests that texts that have to survive the test of time, but your representation of the test of time is not a kind of conservative, let's hang on to the past, but instead a kind of process of rereading, right? So there's something really vigorous and renewing. And I'm just interested in how and here's where my observation and my question come together, how in that teaching you involve students in like connecting with not the writers of the past, but the readers of the past.
Right.
Because my way of
Right.
handling the moment of parody was to talk about an audience, like Whitman's original audience, that actually could buy into his romance
Yeah,
in a
beautiful.
way that they found really difficult. So
Wonderful,
Thank you.
wonderful. Two thoughts, two kind of opposing thoughts that do come together. Jim, the first one is that I delight in that concept that a tragedy in one time becomes a comedy in another one, or that a realistic document read in a particular context becomes the opposite, unrealistic at a different time. So that your students and mine can see Whitman as sarcastic when he was trying to be as honest and direct and humble and all-encompassing, I contain multitudes, as possible, is exactly what the successive readings are. I think, Jim, that the great desaparecido, the great question mark in all that we do is the reader, us, the writers themselves as readers. And of course, it's very difficult to do a history. It's easier to do a biography of Leaves of Grass or of Whitman because we have the data, we have the information, than to do a history of the readers of Leaves of Grass or the history of the readers of Walt Whitman. What we have is the reviews that were published at a certain period, the controversies that he engaged in, the letters that he wrote, the reactions of successive people, the emulations that others did, the translations that people have done in different parts of the world. There would be no Pablo Neruda without Walt Whitman. There would be no Jorge Luis Borges without Walt Whitman. But Borges and Neruda are opposing writers, politically, aesthetically. How could they both land on the same author, the same American author, seeing it completely different? It's as if they are reading two Walt Whitmans. And to me, that is the history of the reading of Walt Whitman, and the history of our students reading Walt Whitman. I am genuinely interested. I have been teaching for 30 years. Nobody should do anything that long if you don't figure out how to. There have been crises. How can I teach it again? How do I do it again? Am I a robot here? And I have become, as time has gone by, genuinely interested in what my students are going to tell me about this new reading of 100 Years of Solitude. It's a book that is going to be very different from the one that I taught just 2 years before. And in many ways, my students are the subject matter in the class. And I'll say just one more thing, Jim. I've been teaching it for a time, a course on the history of love. I feel that universities, colleges, confine our knowledge in departments, and that departments do a disservice to us. I have a harmonious relationship with my department, but I think that we ghettoize knowledge in departments, and that we become what those departments want in the classroom. And in this course, there's a little bit of, there's science and there's humanities, and there is literature and there's philosophy, and there is theater, and there's deliberately breaking the different disciplines and breaking the different departamentals in the departmental ways of looking at knowledge. But one of the fascinating aspects is that in the end, it is these students that are going to react yet once more to Romeo and Juliet today, as they did today in my class just before this, as their parents who were my students too. And their concept of going and dating is totally different from their parents. So to me, it's not only Romeo and Juliet, but it's them reading Romeo and Juliet. They are the subject of the study of love. Romeo and Juliet becomes an excuse, kind of, to see how they react. I think that the history of readers is what makes literature so interesting. the genius we emphasize is in the author, but it's really just as much in the successive readers. We all land. Can you imagine you and I are landing on Leaves of Grass? Who else has landed on it? What have they had to say with that, about that book? What a privilege it is to land on those pages and have all the conversations we can have with the previous readers and the readers that are going to come after us. That is why Leaves of Grass exists to me, for that conversation.
Ilan, just real quick, let me follow up and then somebody else can jump in. You're talking about Shakespeare, of course. There is serious talk. I hear it frequently about the possible need to cancel Shakespeare, to cancel Chaucer, to cancel Milton as male writers that are not where we're at right now. And they're just making life difficult because they're the shadow they cast across the page.
Do you remember RC Fahrenheit 457, where there's only a few people that have to memorize a book in order to keep it going from one generation? I am ready to memorize as many sections of a Othello in order to keep it going. I have already done a few. The fact that literature is besieged is not surprising. The fact that some of us have to take a more courageous and maybe heroic position is important. We have to instill that in the next generation. I feel pity for those who will cancel Shakespeare. Their world is going to be so narrow. And it's not because Shakespeare is wonderful at every level. It's because Shakespeare is complex.
Somebody else. Luis.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
I was an English major also as an undergraduate student, but my experience was very different from RC's because I think that generation that taught RC was a generation right before me, and I can remember their writers were pretty much the writers he identified, but whom in their own time were also kind of revolutionary. Thoreau is not a conformist in any way.
Right.
But I was in my day, we were studying the Southern writers also. They were a part of what we were doing, Robert Penn Warren and so on. But I want to mention three authors that we talked about and who were new to us and were just beginning to be studied, I think, by a lot of English majors. One was we were studying Richard Wright, Native Son. Of course, Native Son had been written long before, but it was just then really part of what you would find in an English department. And also Ralph Ellison, Invisible Man, but last I would mention Flannery O'Connor. But in all three cases, I think the best discussions I ever heard about race were in those classes as an English major so many years ago. It was so exciting, and I maybe you'll agree with me, RC. Those discussions in the 1970s. We didn't really have the vocabulary we have now. We didn't have the knowledge of history in many ways that we have now. We certainly wouldn't know the aftermath, but there was something very, very exciting about studying these writers, looking at them with new eyes. And I wonder if Ilan felt that also when he read those authors. Thank you.
Luis, it's such a wonderful reflection. Because of the nearsighted or myopic way of looking at America and American culture from Mexico, the neighbor to the north. What came in was roughly what I was telling you, plus a few of the bestsellers that I wasn't particularly compelled to go and open up. On occasion, I did, Stephen King and others. But Black literature, African-American literature, didn't make it. But in part, when I came to the United States, it was a bonanza for me to enter Zora Neale Hurston's work, Ralph Ellison, just discovering the language, the aesthetic of the language as a character. I felt thrilled. And then I realized that maybe, and I'm not excusing anybody, please, maybe these books are untranslatable. I am happy that I didn't read them in Spanish. I don't know how you read Zora Neale Hurston in Spanish or Richard Wright. They would be a simplification or and I can tell you too that my intense, maybe even obsessive love for Spanglish, the mix of Spanish and English, which to me is very much a statement of who we are as Latinos in the United States. The mestizaje that takes place linguistically and culturally is the defining aspect of our culture. Is the result of my readings of African American literature and of so-called Black English or Ebonics, and of another novel that I didn't read in Mexico, and I only read in the United States, and I think is one of the greatest novels, American novels and world novels, Call It Sleep by Henry Roth. It's where he plays with Yinglish, a Yiddish that is written in English, that is very much like Zora Neale Hurston or Richard Wright are doing with English, Black English, where the language can be overwrought or broken, all these terms that can be controversial in themselves, but reformulated, reinvigorated, that are just, there's one of the biggest challenges of creative writing programs and of the culture of traditional literature is that very often dissuades people from being experimental when it comes to language, because it will not be understood by others. But when language can become a character, somebody was talking about Joyce, it all comes from there, maybe. That for me was a revelation. And I love hearing a student I love in the classroom when a student waits for a second or two and you start seeing in their forehead what they're thinking, but they haven't begun talking. I love that moment of silence. And I love actually when the language comes out all broken up, so to speak. Again, broken is the wrong term, and I'm using it deliberately here because it is the different languages that exist in the classroom. And it's the non-conforming languages. I don't want them to speak like me. I want them to see my English, but I don't want them to speak like me. I want them to be conscious about how they speak. And I want them to be exposed to writers that, like Faulkner, like Hurston, like Wright, like Roth, that are not only telling you the what, but the how through the language.
Alan, it's a little bit after 1. Do you think it would work maybe to do 2 more questions? Alan, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry, I'm sorry. Yes, I see Misha has her hand up, and so I think 1 or 2 more questions would be perfect. And then just to make sure everyone knows, in case you don't, Ilan's going to be with us again this evening at 7 p.m. Our time, 8 p.m. his time, for a entirely different topic. So I just want to make sure everybody knows that.
There's a really good question in the chat. I'll ask my question after, but I'd like to hear your answer to the question in the chat.
I wasn't paying attention. Is this the question of when
Misha,
talking
could
about?
you read the question?
Yeah, Misha, maybe you could read it.
Sure. This is from Nikki Vardaman, who asks, when talking about cancel culture, you say it's important not to cancel certain classics in order to encourage discomfort in the classroom and discussions. What I wonder, though, is where do you put the line between reading classics, she puts in quotes, or not canceling them, and prioritizing diversifying voices that students encounter by introducing new readings?
Beautiful. Yeah. Nikki, I believe that in anything we do, we prioritize. There is, by reading somebody, you're not reading somebody else. And again, as in an anthology, the hope is that what you have in the anthology is better than what was left out in the anthology, from the anthology. But our role as teachers, our role as editors of anthologies, to tell people this anthology there's no anthology that is not incomplete. All anthologies are incomplete. The same way there is no unabridged dictionaries. All dictionaries are abridged. Languages are always spilling beyond the dictionaries. So my role is to open up in the classroom, feeling that I have a particular connection with a reading or with an author, but I myself begin or invite others, begin and invite others to connect them with recent readings that they have done, with the popular culture. And very often, I have a very fluid view of my syllabus. So the syllabus is not a contract set in stone. I tell students that at the beginning. It can change throughout the semester. And a particular offering that a student gave at one point can become an offering 3 weeks later in the course. So, but that wouldn't, there's also always going to be some privileging and non-privileging. Editors edit by establishing a criteria, not an infallible criteria, but a comprehensive and responsible criteria. And I think that is also the task of the teacher. We are not about including everybody or excluding particular people, but about opening things up and allowing certain conceptions. And I think that the cancel culture is the one that says, I don't want to hear anything about this particular aspect of life. That's where I'm very, very disheartened.
Just quick, I can make this really quick, just a kind of horror story, but something really happened. A few years ago in San Francisco, there was an August Wilson play being produced, definitely our greatest Black playwright, maybe our best playwright. You know, August Wilson is just amazing. So it was a play by August Wilson about Black people. There were Black actors playing Black characters, and the white audience booed and stopped the performance when they heard the N-word. They knew better than the Black playwright, the actors, the production, and so on. That kind of mindless implementation of PC is more common than I think we even talk about, and it's not helpful to anybody at all.
RC, just quickly, and I know Misha wanted to say something. I was close to a publishing house in the South that brought out some years ago an edition of Huckleberry Finn that had cleansed the word slave, the N-word, and replaced it with the word slave or former slave or runaway slave, etc. And I was close to them. I was very unhappy with what they had done. But the editor kept on telling me that his attempt was not to improve on the text, but his attempt was to bring in the text back to the classroom, because otherwise it would not make it there at all. And that once it was in the classroom, the teachers could say, well, you know, this word is actually another word. What do you think about that? And from that perspective, I thought, well, there's a useful approach here. There's a strategy here for inclusion and comprehension. It's you can't clean things. If we don't stage The Merchant of Venice, the end of anti-Semitism is not going to come to an end. We better stage it and engage it in order to understand what anti-Semitism is. Not knowing is not making us better. Knowing is, but knowing comes at a big price. It's uncomfortable to know. The bliss of ignorance is often more attractive, but we're in the business of knowing, and it's very important to push those limits.
As they say, from your mouth to God's ear. Misha, I think the stage is yours. The very last question, no pressure.
Okay. I have so many thoughts and comments on what has been said so far, but I actually have a whole bunch of questions related to interdisciplinarity, but rather than ask you a leading question, why don't I just throw the topic to you and what you think the role of interdisciplinary approaches. should be, can be in the academy or for readers or for scholars.
Thank you, Misha. And I love the conversation that we have begun already. One of the opportunities of visits like this is meeting colleagues like you. And I really appreciate that we began early and that hopefully will continue. I either absolutely believe in interdisciplinarity, or I don't. And it's actually the same thing. I don't want knowledge to be limited by disciplines. To me, that is a ghetto, a form of ghettoizing knowledge. I think it was a great movement to create comparative literature departments. I can't see literature in any other way than comparatively. So I think that if by creating a comparative literature department, the English department is not teaching comparative English literature, what are we doing? All literature is always comparative. It relates to others. And the same thing goes with all other disciplines. I don't think we can, I think that a writer is an anthropologist, and an anthropologist is also a writer, and has to mix with literature and has to mix with the sciences. So by saying that I am absolutely in favor and I am absolutely against, it's because I don't believe there should be a difference between the two. I think we're all doing. Now, it's because we have built the structures that push us to see ourselves as part of the Association of American Anthropologists and not part of the Association of American Sociologists, or whatever you're going to put here. It's preposterous, really. We are all the better when we read outside our disciplines, when we mess up by delving. I don't think that, there is here the tension between a particularist and a universalist might become. Do you know a lot about the comma in the third page of Ulysses, and that is your thesis, your doctoral dissertation? Yes, somebody should know a lot about that comma. It's crucial. I also believe somebody should know all about Ulysses. Maybe less about that comma, but all about Ulysses. So I believe in a tension between that particularism of knowledge and the universalism, the larger views, and between encrusting ourselves in a certain discipline and using that as a platform that brings us out to other disciplines, with the knowledge that our universities are not built for that type of cross-fertilization. And though we think of ourselves as free people, we're very confined in many ways by ourselves and by the structures of the places we professionally work in. And it's hard to break down structures in institutions, very hard. And there are many martyrs, in silent and open. But I think it's a worthy effort, and if that means sometimes being outside academia and doing certain things, or academia changes very slowly. One of the great problems of America right now is that incredibly sophisticated minds feel to me trapped in academia, not fully engaged because of tenure cases or because of what if and what will they say of the discipline or my colleagues or this or that. And in that sense, academia can be a graveyard of great passion, great intellect.
Okay, Alan, do you want to say something else?
No,
I was going to thank you. You've been talking to us for an hour and 50 minutes. We appreciated a wonderful conversation. Alan, do you think we're?
Absolutely. Maybe we can unmute and all thank Ilan out loud for a little noise.
Thank you
all. Thank you all. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
And I hope to see you tonight.
I'm going to hold up his book one more time. What is American Literature? It's just come out from Oxford University Press. It is a wonderful read, and you need to buy several copies.
Thank you, RC. Thank you, Alan. Thank you all.